as everybody's joining today, we're going to ask you to write in the chat box your name, your organization, or your role, where you are, and if you identify as a youth or you're a member of Youth Lead. So please write these into the chat box as you're joining. We've got a couple folks. We're well represented from all over. So those of you who just joined, please add your name, your organization, or your role, where you're based, and if you are a youth or you're a member of Youth Lead. And we have some people sad about the fact that they are not youths anymore. We've got DC, Guatemala, Boston, Texas, Jordan, welcome, Canada, Youth at Heart. Well, I hope all of us are. Pennsylvania, London, Uganda, Baltimore, welcome everybody. More DC, Kenya, Mozambique, welcome everyone. Looks like DC has the highest number of folks so far. But Southern Africa is representing strong. Poland, Bangladesh, Liberia, great. And a strong youth presence. And from those who are young at heart. All right. So as people are joining, please continue in the chat to add your name, organization, role, where you are, and if you are a youth or member of Youth Lead. And I'm going to go ahead and start the introduction so we can move into our work that we are going to do together today. So my name is Jessie Bellema. I'm a director with Global Knowledge Initiative, and Global Knowledge Initiative is going to be presenting this third part in our series on systems mapping today. We are a member of the YouthPower Learning and Evaluation Consortium, which is a continuation of the YouthPower Learning Project, which was a multi-year USAID-funded project. It's been around for about 5 years. We're in our first year of YP2LE at this point. This is focused on positive youth development. So next slide, please. Which you all are likely very familiar with at this point in time. It's a model that looks at providing youth with assets, the ability to leverage those assets through agency, and the ability to contribute to positive change for themselves and their communities within an enabling environment that supports them to do so. And our learning network here is a reflection of this approach. And we involved youth throughout the process of designing this network and redesigning it. Next slide. So the learning network is a key component of the knowledge transfer and application of the learning related to the positive youth development approach. And this is a good example of one of the things that we're trying to do through this network, which is share knowledge and information for positive youth development. So as GKI, this is one of our offerings to the network for systems learning. So I'm going to turn it over to Hina, who is our fellow. I'm a community manager in the network, and Hina's one of the other community managers. So we're the ones you're going to see frequently as you're engaging in the network through the COPs and other types of groups. So I'm going to hand it over to Hina to introduce the workshop itself and take it away.
Thank you, Jessie, and welcome everyone. It's great to see you again. If you attended the first and second sessions, welcome back. As Jessie just said, this is the last session of 3 in analyzing complex systems. And a quick reminder for those of you who complete all 3 events, we offer a certificate of completion for your attendance. And to get this certificate, you must attend all 3 sessions and then complete a short quiz or assignment after each session that we will send you in an email. So with that, let's get started. Here is the agenda for today. First, we will review our causal loop diagram in Kumu. Then we'll review leverage points in the system that are ripe for change. And then we will go through an exercise called an impact versus feasibility matrix, which is a way to prioritize leverage points for better decision making. And then we'll go through a wrap up and next steps. Before we move on, let's not forget to meet our trainers. So I can introduce myself first. My name is Hina, and I'm a communities manager for the YouthPower Learning Network. Because the YouthPower Learning Network has been active for 5 years, this past year we wanted to take some time to pause and reflect on the first 5 years of this network, celebrate its successes, and then consider how we might increase network engagement even more going forward. One of the things that members told us during the research phase was their interest in systems thinking. We know that systems thinking can be a buzzword and kind of confusing to understand. At Global Knowledge Initiative, we've been training people on how to practically use systems thinking in their daily work for the past decade. And that's what we wanted to bring to this network. It's been really fun to work with all of you during these past few weeks, and we look forward to staying in touch even after this final session is over. A quick review of what we've done so far. So in previous sessions, we've covered a lot. Session 3 will be focused on strategic decision making. So we have a map now. You've all done your loops. We saw all the loops that you submitted that looked wonderful. And now we'll focus on what to do with that map. What can the map tell us, and how can we use the map and the mapping process to fuel conversations and inform decisions? We have a few objectives for the day. So first is how to connect loops to create a complete causal loop diagram. And then second is how to use the causal loop diagram to find leverage points and inform strategic decisions. I will now pass it over to Morgan to give us a recap of what we learned in the previous sessions.
Thank you, Hina. If you could take us straight on to the next slide. Thank you. So some of you will recognize this slide that we have been showing you as we've been going through these sessions. These are our 6 steps to facilitating the co-creation of a causal loop diagram, or as we refer to them as CLDs. All of these steps can be conducted in a workshop format or using a whole systems in a room approach, which is something you'll hear often from USAID partners, basically bringing together stakeholders that you've identified as being primary actors within a system to get them to work together on developing one of these causal loop diagrams, or by conducting research and drawing the map yourself, and finally validating the results with various stakeholder groups. So last week we covered steps 1 through 4. We started by identifying the kinds of actors we could bring together. Hina had set up a nice chart where we could write in the actors we identified from the case study. We built out a sense of the priority forces in the system using the iceberg model. We looked at an example and then used the iceberg model to help us identify forces applied across the system at various levels. And we revisited the definitions of nodes and linkages or connections, looked at how to write loops and start to establish narratives for each loops, looking for gaps in the loop's logic, and finally creating loops from the Youth Empowerment International Organization case study. So I think we're ready to jump straight into step 5, which is linking the loops together to see how the forces are connected. So at this stage, we're looking to zoom out of the component of systems. We're looking to zoom out. So this is the bit of systems thinking where we try to move away from looking at individual loops and look at how all of the loops fit together into this larger system. I was going to say next slide, but I can see that we're there already. Excellent. So to give you an overview of what happens at this step, we start by reading through each loop that we have drawn together and highlight which nodes are repeated across the loops. This is the point where we start to understand the larger story of what's going on. We are drawing up a narrative and starting to see how these narratives intersect, where there are differences, where there are surprising connections, and see the patterns across the loops. At the second stage, we create a new high-level loop from the repeated nodes. Sometimes we call this the deep structure. And this is where ultimately it's a pattern that is repeated across the loops and becomes central to the story that you're telling. Finally, we merge the loops together using these repeated nodes as our center and add additional connections. And so we go from having our individual loops, which are quite circular, into what looks like your more traditional systems map and a map that's representative of this larger complex story. So I'm going to take us straight into having a look at the loops that we drew up last week. Here we go. So you should be able to see my screen now. And as we go through, if you have any questions that come up, please do put them in the chat. I'll pause every now and again and ask Katie to identify questions and bring them to my attention, since I won't be able to read the chat as I am sharing my screen. So to revisit, we were looking at this case study from about the Youth Empowerment International Organization and how they could better support youth-led agricultural businesses in Machakos, Kenya. One of the questions that we were answering is, what accounts for the degree to which YEIO can support youth-led agricultural businesses? So last week, we imagined bringing together actors relevant to YEIO's work to explore the factors at play in successfully supporting youth agricultural entrepreneurs. We identified 3 powerful forces with the power to affect youth's ability to engage in agripreneurship in Machakos, Kenya. And these 3 were training on best manufacturing practices. And this is the loop that was drawn up. And I'll start by walking us through it. So to remind you, you'll notice we have our nodes, which are our circles here. And each node is a factor within the system. And we have our linkages. These are the arrows between the nodes. Some arrows are blocks or flat, and some of them are dashed. So the dashed arrows are opposite connections and the flat arrows are same connections. As we talk through, listen carefully to how the relationship is between each nodes, and you'll start to recognize and remember how the opposite relationships work and how the similar relationships work. So if I'm talking through this loop, we start with youth having a lack of experience in best manufacturing practices. And see, it's very, very small, but there's a minus sign here. So as we notice a decrease in youth experience or a lack in youth experience in best manufacturing practices, the need for training in best manufacturing practices increases. That's why we have the plus node here. As this need for training in best manufacturing practices increases, the number of trainings offered by YEIO increases to meet this need. As the number of trainings increases, the opportunities for youth to attend trainings obviously also increase. But this leads to a trade-off. The youth need to determine which opportunities they're going to attend. And what we notice here is there's a reduction in the number of youth attending trainings. Now, something that Hina and Katie identified last week was this external factor at play, the idea that the trainings were falling on the same day as market day. And as these trainings are falling on the same day, this trade-off is becoming more and more pertinent, and the number of youth attending trainings is reducing. As the number of youth attending trainings reduces, the number of youth trained in business experience reduces as well. And as the number of youth trained in experience reduces, so does the success of YO's intervention. Now, within this, we've got some items that are external to the central loop. We have the trust between YO and youth, which is decreasing, which is also negatively affecting the success of YO's intervention and negatively affecting youth's willingness to attend youth trainings. And there's also this extra piece, the perception that youth are unmotivated. This is YO's perception, because they're putting out all of these trainings and they're finding that youth aren't attending. And again, this leads to a decrease in the trust between YEIO and youth. So I'll pause there because I've kind of gone straight into the deep end, hoping that you recognize some of this from last week, and wanted to ask Katie if there's any questions at this stage about this loop.
There aren't any questions in the chat yet.
Excellent. So I'll bring us on to the next item that YO identified as a powerful force. And here is access to finance. So you'll start to recognize we still have some of our orange items where this loop is linked to the first loop, but I'll show you how these tie in later on, so don't get too worried by those. So YIO identifies that there is a need for flexible loans that fit youth and small and medium-sized enterprise needs. But the number of youth applying for the loans are small, and therefore there is less adequate funding for youth SMEs, leading to a smaller and lesser expansion of youth businesses, again affecting the success of YO's intervention. The fact that YO's intervention is perceived as unsuccessful affects YO's relationship with the bank, leading to YO's willingness to challenge power dynamics in the bank to be reduced, again affecting the availability of flexible loans that fit youth SME needs. Now, this is leading to an attitudinal factor, the fact that youth are feeling unheard because the requirements are not changing for the bank loans, and so they're not able to access loans. Again, as youth feel more and more unheard, you have this plus sign, as they feel more and more unheard, the trust between YO and youth decreases. And finally, private sector mentorship. So working on looking at business skills among youth again, as we notice that there's a lack of business skills among youth, YO identifies a need for a program that pairs youth with mentors in the private sector. As this increases, we start to see more communications and coordinations from YIO, but these are not adequate. And so youth are coming to meetings unprepared, which leads to an increase in the private sector perception that YIO meetings are long and poorly organized. The fact that as the private sector perceives that YIO meetings are long and poorly organized, the more they perceive that, the less private sector are willing to engage and attend YIO meetings. The less that private sector are willing to engage and attend YIO meetings, we get a reduction in knowledge transfer from private sector to youth SMEs. Now, this affects a bunch of different items. We have, again, this trust theme coming up again. The youth trust in mentors is reducing, and the perception that the mentoring program is effective reduces, which has a negative effect on the value proposition of private sector participation, which affects private sector engagement and attendance at YO meetings. So here we've got two loops tied together. It's almost a figure of eight. We've got this one loop showing the effect on business skills, which are reducing, and YO's intervention currently not working. and in fact leading to more distrust between private sector and youth and private sector and YIO, and potentially having a negative effect on business skills. And we have this second reinforcing negative loop going here, where as the knowledge transfer from private sector to youth SMEs decreases, we get a perception that the program is ineffective and the value proposition of private sector participation is reduced. And so we have private sector actors not wanting to engage, which is again reinforcing, getting worse and worse. And in the center, youth trusted mentors getting worse and worse as well. Now let's bring this all together.
Morgan, before we move on to the entire map, we do have some questions in the chat.
Excellent, Katie, bring us in.
The first question is from Catherine Patterson, and she asks if there's any significance to the clockwise versus counterclockwise of the loop. I believe the second loop you showed was actually going in a different direction. Morgan, would you like to answer that?
So this is where I have to admit that drawing up these loops and the connections becomes a bit of an art rather than a science. The counterclockwise versus clockwise is simply according to where there was most space to put the items. It's usually nice to be able to show loops in this circular way. I could have arranged this by have perception over here and move youth, trust, and mentors, but then you would have more crossing over arrows and it becomes less legible. And so there's a lot of this within the visual aspect of systems mapping of which connections am I going to draw in that continue to tell the story while keeping it legible and readable, so that to someone who's got to know the map is able to identify different nodes and how they connect. So the answer is that most simply it's not relevant, but that you might choose to try and keep things circular just because they're easier to read and to sort of remind yourself that there is this loop going on, rather than, you know, making everything squashed and linear and keeping all the arrows going in the same direction. Are there any more questions, Katie?
Yes, there's a few more. I think the most pertinent one that I would like you to answer is, can you clarify the dotted lines versus the solid lines one more time?
Yeah, I'll put up an easier example. Here we go. So the dotted lines represent an opposite relationship and the flat lines represent a same relationship. So to show you an example of this, what that means is as this node increases, this node will decrease, or as this node decreases, this node will increase. That's for opposite relationships. With the same relationship, as this node increases, this node increases. As this node decreases, this node decreases. And so in words, we would say, as youth experience in best manufacturing increases, for example, the need for training in best manufacturing practices would decrease. And so that's an opposite relationship. Now, it could go the other way around. In our case, in our story, youth experience in best manufacturing processes decreasing, which is leading to an increase in the need for best manufacturing practicing training. And then for the same relationship, the number of BMP trainings offered by YIO increases, and so the opportunities for youth to attend trainings naturally also increases. If the number of BMP trainings were to decrease, the opportunities for youth to attend trainings would decrease.
Perfect. And then just one more point that Lisa, I think I'll just answer your question myself. You made a point that it seems that only business mentors were surveyed to actually create this loop. And so it's only showing one perspective in these loops. And yes, that's very true. And I think that really hones in on our point that who you have in the room is one of the most important steps to actually creating this causal loop diagram. What is on the paper will only be representative of who's in the room. And so your point is very well made. And yes, we would like to have a more diverse audience writing this case study that we used to create this map so that it would be a more accurate representation. So Morgan, yes, continue. Thank you.
Perfect. So with that, let's tie all of these loops together. So we have our training on best manufacturing practices loop, and it ties into our access to finance. You can see there are some items, some nodes that are shared by both loops. And finally, all three together, our private sector mentorship, access to finance, and training on best practices. So you start to see how there are stories to be told across loops and between loops. And in the center here, you can see the nodes that are most repeated across the different loops. Now, this isn't a final version of the systems map. This is a work in progress. We wanted to show you what a map looks like as you're working on it. And so there's some aspects, for example, youth trust in mentors and trust between youth and YIO is present in the private sector mentorship loop. And also over here, we have trust between YIO and youth. And these could be brought closer together given that they're the same theme. And it would just require a bit of rejigging of the loops. So I wanted to show you an incomplete version to show you how this is, it's an art and it's an iterative process. So as you bring these together, you start to notice some items that are more connected than others. And so I'm going to zoom in on them here. This brings us to this idea of a deep structure. This is a loop that is central to the question the YIO is asking, which is what is affecting the degree to which YIO is successful in supporting agriculture, rural entrepreneurs, youth agriculture entrepreneurs. And the piece that comes up again and again across these loops is trust and the perception of success and the perception that YIO is an effective partner. And we have this sense that as the perception of YIO being an ineffective partner reduces, the youth don't want to work with them, the banks don't listen to them, and the private sector partners don't want to engage in the mentorship program. And so this becomes a really key piece. YIO urgently needs to change the way that they're engaging with the youth in order to improve their offering so that they're having a positive effect, because right now their perception of not being an effective program is leading to a disruption in the system. It's affecting relationships between youth and other actors in a negative way, which is obviously not what we're going for. So we've drawn up a map. This is where we start to look for areas of leverage. And I'd like to hand it back to Katie to take us on to step 6. But first I wanted to pause again and see if there's any questions now that we've brought the map all together.
There aren't any questions. Oh, they're coming in. I'll just explain that we are using the Kumu platform to make this map, and it is a free platform. So please go check it out. It's kumu.io. You can make an account and play around with it. We have another question from Catherine asking, the number of youth attending trainings node has an arrow going in both directions. So can you have nodes that are not affected, but rather that are solely cause effects?
Yes, so I think this is a piece where we need to think about what the boundaries are of our system. So everything is caused by something and has an effect. We've talked about this in the first session about how everything is interconnected, from the breakfast you have through to universal shifts in the way the planets are moving and gravitational forces, whatever. The connections go from the minutiae to the largest you want. But we need to stop mapping at some point. And so you might have nodes, for example, trainings fall on the same day as market day is a node that has an effect, but we've not gone into what the loop is around, you know, why is the market held on that day? And why was the training chosen to be on that day? We've determined that for the purpose of this narrative and this intervention, it's not necessary to go into that node, and instead we can just leave it as a node that's affecting others.
Perfect. I think those are the only questions we have right now.
Excellent. Then Hina, if you could take us back to the PowerPoint and on to step 6.
Perfect. So as Morgan alluded to, step 6 is creating space for conversation around the different perspectives represented in the system. And I know we've talked a lot about the fact that a causal loop diagram is not just about the diagram, it's about the conversations that you can fuel around the diagram. And so one of the ways that you can fuel these conversations to inform strategy is by identifying leverage points in the system. Next slide, Hina. So a leverage point occurs where a small shift in the system can produce big changes throughout the system. In systems thinking, we use leverage points to determine where the system might be frozen, where it might be ripe for change. And understanding these systems dynamics allows us to build a strategy and that might include a set of interventions that would work across many different parts of the system. And leverage points can have both positive and negative impacts on the system based on your goal. So they do not only have to be positive impacts, you should look at both. And onward to the next slide, Hina. So for true systems change to occur, collaborators must identify and act on opportunities that actually affect the entire system. Doing this requires us to zoom out and grasp the big picture. So if you remember back to the previous session, we had presented the iceberg model. And this is one of the models that you can use to zoom out and see the entire system. And so you aren't looking at just what's above the water, which is what we tend to look at. You are also looking at what's below the water. And so as you move down deeper into the water, there is increasing leverage. So looking at leverage points across the iceberg requires participants to address the root causes of the problem, which is the bottom half of the iceberg, and not just mitigate the symptoms, which is that one part that's above the water. And so when we are looking at this slide, we have presented the events, pattern, trends. We are anticipating and planning based on those patterns when we're designing an intervention or a project. When we are addressing structures, we are designing based on the relationships and power dynamics. And when we are addressing mental models or behavior change, we are transforming the system through behavior change. And so many of you all have probably heard and designed programs around some or perhaps all of these. We oftentimes talk about behavior change campaigns in development. We also talk a lot about relationships and power dynamics. And so we understand that many of us are already designing around these. But we also understand that a lot of times when designing projects or when intervening in the middle of a project, we do have limitations and constraints, and those can be things like funding or the timeline of the actual project, as well as who you have and the capacities that your team has. And so I just want to caveat this with, we're not saying that if you aren't working in the mental model space and you aren't transforming behavior change, it doesn't mean your intervention isn't good, isn't helpful, isn't changing the system. It just is meaning that you have to understand the entire system in order to decide where you might be best placed to work within the system. And so understanding how each of these pieces in the iceberg are interconnected allows you to understand the system as a whole, which is also the goal of creating a systems map, to sort of zoom out, see the entire system, so then you can be better informed in the decisions you're making. So next slide, Hina, we will talk about how do you actually facilitate this process of finding leverage. And so I'm going to share these steps with you, and then we'll walk through sort of a demo of how we might do this. And then we'll pass it over to Hina to take us into strategy land. So the first step for facilitating finding leverage points is to actually tell the participants what the 5 types of leverage are. The subsequent 5 slides will show us that. The second step is to ask participants to identify leverage points one at a time. And so we'll walk through each leverage point, identify them on the map. Generally, we will create a large wall-sized map. We'll either print it out if it's in a workshop format. We'll use sticky notes to create this. Or if you're virtual, using a platform like Mural, which we presented in the last session, is a great way to allow for collaboration of groups. And so you'll ask participants to begin highlighting nodes that they think these leverage points exist on. And then once you've walked through all the 5 types of leverage, you'll identify areas on the map where there are large clusters of leverage points. And the reason we look at these large clusters is because generally there will be a lot of energy. That part of the system might be ripe for change. And so it's a good place for you to look at to inform strategy. And so then lastly, step 4 will facilitate a conversation around those clusters. And so we might ask questions like, why did you choose this as a leverage point? For example, if someone identified a place as frozen and then someone else identified it as a positive bright spot, that's an interesting learning. Why are people seeing the system differently? You might ask what stakeholders are involved at each leverage point, or perhaps which stakeholders are missing and are not currently involved, but maybe should be involved. And lastly, what opportunities do these leverage points present? And this will sort of ease you into the strategy. Next slide, thank you. So I'm now going to walk us through the 5 different types of leverage points in the framework that we use. The first type is frozen. And so this is places in the system where behavior is deeply entrenched and unlikely to change in the future. And this is an important leverage point to look at because it's most likely the hardest place to intervene in the system. When these behaviors are so deeply entrenched, we know that it might take 20+ years to actually change that behavior. And so if your project is a 5-year-long project, you most likely would want to use a frozen leverage point as your guiding star, as something you aspire to change, but within your 5-year project timeframe, you most likely won't be able to change that. And so you'll incrementally work to that, but it would not be your primary leverage point you choose to intervene at. Next slide. The second one is pent-up energy for change. Change is oftentimes created through movements, where if there are places in the system where someone or something is really trying to disrupt this status quo, then you might want to think about how you can support or build upon that energy. And so this is a good place to sort of think about partnerships and how you would want to build upon the work that's already being done. Next slide. The third one is bright spots. And bright spots are very similar to energy, but the positive change is already happening. So energy could be that someone is thinking, you're hearing about the idea that change needs to occur, but that the change hasn't necessarily occurred yet. Bright spots is that the change has already happened, and then you want to think about how you can amplify this positive change and once again build upon it. Thank you. So the fourth is ripple effects. So certain parts of the system are highly connected. They are perhaps in the middle of your systems map. They have many arrows pointing in and leaving that node. And so if you are able to change that part of the system, you will most likely experience secondary and tertiary effects along with the primary effect. And so that change might ripple throughout all of the other loops or forces in the system. And then our last one is mixed bag. A mixed bag is a place that sometimes goes positive and sometimes goes negative. And so many times in a systems map, this looks like a place where someone might be making a decision. And if you're able to provide the correct incentives, perhaps you can sway their decision towards the positive side so that the loop is always going in the way that you want it to go. And so those are the 5 different types of leverage. Now I am going to share our Kumu map with some leverage points on the map. Correct one. And Hina, if you can also share the link to this, we'll give you a link. You're not able to change anything in the map itself, but you can sort of scroll around and move about on your own if you want to give you that experience. And so on this map, we've identified 4 different leverage points. These are the pink icons that we've added. And so I'll talk us through each of the leverage points, and then we'll walk through an activity of identifying our own leverage points. And so once again, in a facilitated workshop, you would want everyone to choose leverage points on their own. You would most likely not present them as we're doing in this case, but to speed things along, we're presenting some preset leverage points. And then we'll give you a chance to sort of play around with it as well after this. So the first leverage point we identified on the access to finance loop is a mixed bag leverage point. And this is on the flexible loans that fit youth SME needs. And so we know that in this loop, the loans right now have very strict requirements. And the loan size is very big. And so many of the youth actually don't need that loan. And so, but some do. And so sometimes this works in a positive way and the youth do apply. However, sometimes they don't apply because the loan is not what they need. And so we identified this as a mixed bag leverage point. And then we'll go down to the green loop. Scroll out a little bit. The private sector mentorship loop. And we have a leverage point energy, where there's pent-up energy for change on adequate coordination and communications from YEIO. And so if you remember back to the case study, we learned that a lot of the things that occur in this system are because there's not communication. There's not enough communication between youth. In this loop, there's not enough communication between the private sector. And so if YEIO is able to coordinate and communicate better, then this could easily change this loop. And so then the third leverage point we will look at on the orange loop, the training on best manufacturing practices, we'll look at this bright spot. And this is on opportunities for youth to attend trainings. And we decided that this was a bright spot because we're actually really impressed that they were able to increase the number of opportunities for youth to attend trainings. And from the narrative, the case study, it looked like the youth actually wanted these trainings and wanted to attend these trainings. However, they weren't able to attend these trainings because these trainings fell on the same day as the market day. And so further down the loop, there are challenges, but the fact that more trainings are being offered to youth in the activities that they want to learn and to develop their capacities in areas that they're interested in is a huge bright spot in this system. And then our last leverage point that we identified was this one right in the middle. So it's hard to show you all, but it is the ripple effect. And so if you remember to the definition of ripple effect, this means that if this is changed, you will have reverberating effects throughout the system. And so if we zoom out and we look at where this node is in the map, you'll see that it's a very central node to the map. So there's lots of connections going in and out of it. And this is the trust between YEIO and youth is something that's mentioned throughout the case study over and over again. And so if we're able to change this and create greater trust, then that would have huge impacts on all of the other loops because it's all highly connected to each other. And so now we're going to go back to these slides, and we are going to ask you all to spend some time exploring the map in the Kumu link that Hina has shared, and to write in the chat places where you think the system is frozen. And so remembering the definition of a frozen leverage point, this is where system behavior is deeply entrenched and unlikely to change in the near future. And so we'll take like 3 to 5 minutes to do that. As things start coming in the chat, I'll either speed up or add time as needed. But feel free to move around and zoom in on the loops if you're able to open the Kumu link, which we can share again. And begin to, think about where our behavior is deeply entrenched in this system. You can also think back to the case study, if you remember the narrative from that, to determine what doesn't look like it's going to change in this system, or what would take perhaps 10 to 20 years to change in order to create huge change in the system. And please ask questions in the chat if you're feeling stuck. I'm happy to walk people through identifying these. I'm seeing some ideas roll in. Also, if you're having trouble accessing the map, please let us know and I can continue to share my screen. It just is a bit small when you're not able to zoom in on the individual loops. So I'm seeing some thoughts around private sector and the fact that they're busy. I think this is a challenge that if you've ever worked with private sector, you're probably very familiar with this. And then I'm seeing thoughts around power dynamics at the bank and the biased perceptions about youth. I'll pause and keep letting them roll in because I don't want to give all the answers away based on what people are saying.
And I've just shared the link again, just in case anyone didn't make it in the first round.
This is great. I'm beginning to see some repeat ideas, specifically around perceptions of banks and changing them and giving or creating trust between banks and youth. Then also I'm seeing some thoughts around the valuing of youth experiences and their knowledge for both men and women. I think that's also a great point and perhaps isn't shown in this map as much as it might be if youth were the ones creating this map, which I think the case study was less written from the youth's perspective. And then I'm seeing a lot of thoughts around financial resources, and that lack of funding will most likely continue to be a challenge because resources are always being stretched and always being pulled in different directions. And so that continues to be a challenge and might be frozen. Great. So I'm also going to pause and ask if there are any questions. I'm seeing lots of great answers, but I don't want to skip over any questions that might be on your minds. So please put those in the chat if you do have questions as well. And then I see another point that there are so many frozen items coming up. So it seems that there is no hope. And I really hope that's not the case at the end of this. I think one of the challenges with the way the case study was written, and one of the things we were hoping would come out, is that it was perhaps not written using everyone's perspective. And so if we bring everyone into a room and we're to create this map all together, there would be conversations started around these. So perhaps I see the fact that private sector is even involved in the first place as a bright spot. And so even though a lot of us are identifying private sector is always busy as a challenge, it will continue to be a challenge, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's frozen or that we can't incentivize their participation in specific ways. Maybe we only include them in 30-minute conversations. We tell them exactly what the agenda is, and then they're able to come, contribute, and then you can take that information and continue working with the youth with that information. And so I think these conversations that would be created around these leverage points that are coming up is how you would actually realize that not all of these are really frozen. And we have to come up with some innovative ways to engage people differently. Some of them might actually be frozen, but I don't think all of the things that we're identifying are hopeless. So I'm seeing there's a question around short-term versus long-term frozen issues. And I think that's a great point. And so I think that's sort of why I'm seeing not all of the ideas that you all are coming with as necessarily frozen, because I'm using the time frame of probably 20 years would be frozen. If you can change it within a 5-year USAID project, then perhaps it's not frozen. And so I think, yeah, maybe we make 2 different frozen options as long-term frozen and short-term frozen to say that we won't be working on long-term frozen ideas or leverage points, but we could work on short-term frozen leverage points. I think that's a great point. So now we're going to move on to the next one. And I would ask that everyone share in the chat areas where they think there's pent-up energy for change. And hopefully this will give us a little more hope because this is where energy is already occurring, where someone or something is beginning to disrupt the status quo, trying to make new patterns, trying to change the directionality of the loop. And so take 3 to 5 minutes to think through some areas where there is energy and chat when you come up with some ideas. And I'm also seeing a great comment from Wallace saying that YEIO maybe too prescriptive in its approach, making them unable to work well with youth who need a more flexible approach. And I think this is a great point because it's leading us to this idea of how you might then strategize around these leverage points and how YEIO could change their interventions and their strategy of working with youth to better fit the needs of youth. So someone mentioned building business skills among youth as a bright spot. And as Marjorie highlighted, trainings and mentoring opportunities also as, sorry, not bright spots, as areas of energy. And then Miriam had a great point about starting earlier than what YEIO is currently trying to do. Start from basic education levels to build entrepreneurship spirit among youth in early grades. That's a great point and a great idea for how YEIO might change the programming. And I am seeing a couple of comments around the importance of mentorship and just that they haven't quite figured out how to make it effective, but that it's a good idea. And so it's really, there are a ton of bright spots and energy, and it seems like they're on the right path. They're just not quite implementing correctly. And so if you remember back to the case study, that was actually sort of our guiding principle of the case study was how might YEIO increase engagement across their project with all different actors, with youth, with private sector, with banks, whomever else needs to be involved, government. And so it's great to see that you all are sort of thinking beyond the loops that are on the paper and what else we might need to add to this map to create a more comprehensive picture. So with that, I am going to pass it over to Hina to talk us through how we might then take these leverage points and inform a strategy around these leverage points.
Thanks, Katie. All right, so as everyone saw, we had a few leverage points. Usually when we're doing this in real life, in a room or in a virtual environment, you can have a lot of leverage points. Today, I think Katie showed 4, but you can have, 10, 15, depending on how big your map is and how many people you have in the room. And usually projects or organizations have to prioritize where they're best primed to intervene at in the system, because one actor or one project or one organization can't intervene at all the leverage points. And so one way of doing this is using the impact versus feasibility matrix. This matrix, as the name suggests, helps us prioritize each leverage point by its level of these two things. Feasibility is concerned with how possible is it for your organization to intervene at this certain leverage point successfully, given the resources and capacities that the organization has. Impact is the level of change this intervention will create or is expected to create to achieve the stated goal. if you remember, the North Star for this case study was how might we increase engagement in the YEIO project from all stakeholders. Next, let's take a closer look at the matrix, and I'll walk you through how you actually use it. If you take a closer look at this matrix, you'll see that the x-axis is feasibility, and then the y-axis is impact. Both of the axes increase from low to high. The way to use this matrix first is to make a list of your leverage points. Then you'll move on to step 1, and you'll line up each leverage point from low to high based on just feasibility. So this means that you are ranking each leverage point, and let me show you how to do that. So let's say you'll see that there's L1, L2, L3, L4, L5. Usually these would actually like spell out what each leverage point is. And I would say, I wonder which one of these leverage points is most feasible for me and my organization. So let's say that I'm doing it, and I'll show you live how you would do it. So first you would line it up on the feasibility scale. So let's say that I, with my colleagues, decide that L5 is the most feasible, or is the least feasible. So I would put it here. And then L3 is also low on the feasibility scale, in my opinion. So I'll put it here. And then I think 2, 4, and 1 are all feasible. So they're high on the feasibility scale, but let's say that I think 4 is right here, and then 2 is here. Oh, let's see if my technology agrees with me. And then I think that 1 is really feasible. And so I would rank it like that. And next, what I would do is I would consider the impact of each of these leverage points. And I would now move them into the map to determine the impact. So let's say I think L5, the impact would be really, really high. So then I would drag it up here. Sorry, everyone. L3, let's say that I think impact will be medium. So I would move it here. And so on and so forth. Let's say that L4, I think, again, impact will be high. Let's say L2, I think impact will be low. And then again, L1, let's say that I think the impact will be really high. And I see a lot of questions are coming in. Let me walk you through this really quickly, and then we'll answer the questions after this activity. And so the way that I would read this is leverage point 1, I think the impact is really high, but the feasibility is low. Leverage point 3, impact is medium, but feasibility is still pretty low. Leverage point 4, impact is high and feasibility is pretty high. Leverage point 2, feasibility is high, but impact is pretty low. And then leverage point 1, both feasibility and impact are really high. So what do these curves mean right here? Usually when picking a leverage point to act on, you would want to pick something that is both feasible and has impact. The leverage points right for interventions are the ones that live in this area above the curve, so around right here. What we'll do now is we'll try to use the feasibility versus impact matrix on the leverage points that we came up with Katie. So I ask everyone to get out your piece of paper and draw this matrix on your paper, and then take about 2 to 3 minutes to put each of these leverage points in the matrix. And we'll give you some quiet time to do this. And I see some questions coming in. How do you determine where to place the curves? The curve is already placed in there for you, so it's always going to be there. It just comes with the map.
I also see a couple of questions around the subjectivity of placing these and determining what impact and feasibility actually is. And so this process is mostly for a team to use as a group to determine what they think is most feasible and most impactful. It is subjective, and we're not trying to apply sort of formulas of cost-benefit analysis to this. However, there is a lot of research out there on how to do a cost-benefit analysis on sort of social change and social movements. And so if you are interested in specific numbers and formulas and getting quite complicated and into modeling, perhaps there's a ton of research out there. But our purposes for this are more to create a conversation, and this would be mostly with a team or perhaps like a network, a group of people, to sort of talk through, like, so we understand the different types of the different leverage points. We picked 4 as our most important leverage points, but which one do we want to start with, or which 2 do we want to start with to actually form a strategy around? And so our purposes for using this tool are not necessarily to actually come up with specific numbers and use modeling. So it is based off of assumptions of the team and the people choosing and making the decisions.
Yep, exactly. And we hope that if we can walk you through an example with the leverage points that we have, that it'll make a little bit more sense and provide clarity in terms of how this works and the conversations that you can have around using this model. And so it also helps surface assumptions and perceptions that people have in the room and is just a venue for conversation. And with that, let's move on to the activity, and then we'll keep taking questions once we complete the activity. So like I said, just a piece of paper and then draw the matrix as it appears exactly like this. And then you'll see that the 4 leverage points that we came up with are listed here in this slide. And this is your opinion. There's no right or wrong answers. But like I said and showed, just first rank them by feasibility on this axis, and then put them where you think they belong on this map. So I'll give everyone about 2 minutes to do that. And as you're thinking through this, I would love to see in the chat which leverage points you had in this area above the curves right here. And so just type in the leverage point or points that live in this area of your map, and we'll see if there's consensus among our group or if we're not aligned. All right, I see some answers coming in. A lot of people had the bright spot, which is opportunities for youth to attend trainings. Some had a good leverage point might be loans that fit youth SME needs. Another person said adequate coordination of meetings with youth and private sector might be a good leverage point to act at. I'll take one more minute to see what everyone else thought too, and then we can move on. It would also be really interesting to hear what everyone thought was the low feasibility and low impact, so what didn't fall within these curves, if you'd like to share that. Good point from Lisa that for her, ripple and mixed bag did not fall within the curves yet. So she's thinking timeline here. So I see there is some consensus here, which is great. This means that when we're working in a room with a team or an organization, that they might be aligned on a leverage point that they want to intervene at, and then they can go ahead and design a project to do just that. However, more than likely will be that different actors might pick different leverage points in the system as the most feasible or the most impactful. And guess what? That's totally fine. That's okay. So for example, what USAID chooses given its resources and capacities might be different than what a small youth-led organization might choose. We want multiple actors to work within the system at different levels. What's feasible for one organization might not be feasible for another. This means that there needs to be conversations about partnerships, collaboration, and working together to achieve results. Another note that I have here is that you don't always have to pick the leverage point with the highest impact and feasibility. This goes back to Lisa's point about timeline. So even if your team considers something really high on this matrix, it might be feasible only in the long term, let's say the next 10 or 20 years. And your project might need to show results earlier than that. So it's more than okay to pick a mix of leverage points on the matrix and address some low-hanging fruits or some short-term impacts, and leave those long-term goals to be addressed at a later time, or to say, this is our North Star, we are working towards addressing this, but it probably won't happen in the timeline. And okay, so let's pause for questions a little bit more. So Marjorie is asking, how do you deal with subjectivity though? How to come to consensus if people have different hopes and different, see it differently. And so again, this is a space for conversation. By using this matrix, we're not actually trying to come to one leverage point that will address that. And so people might have different ideas of what intervention they would like to act at. And so that creates a venue for conversation. Perhaps one actor would like to take on one part of the system because that's what they have energy for and that's what their expertise lies in. And another actor wants to act in another part of the system, and that's totally fine. There doesn't have to be consensus. It's more about working together to find ways to partner and collaborate to work at different parts of the system.
And I think another thing to add to what Hina was saying is when you're going through this activity, clarifying, perhaps you make criteria for both what feasibility and what impact means to you or to the people in the room. and coming to a consensus around that criteria or sort of definition of each of those words will also help you to facilitate that conversation. Because if you all agreed on one definition or one criteria, then if someone is arguing a different point, you can point back to the criteria and say, remember, we decided this, like, that's a really great point. But because our criteria is telling us this, we're going to move forward with these 3 leverage points. But as Hina said, it's really about the conversation, and then perhaps around who else, what other stakeholders and actors you need in order to carry these out. Maybe something becomes extremely feasible if you have different people involved. What might be not feasible for your team, if you bring in one other actor, it might be really high on the feasibility. And so that might completely change the dynamics and what you choose to move forward with.
Yep.
So I'm seeing another question, but I was trying to make sense of it.
Producing a consensus, always the major goal, is what Basie asking. Katie, do you have an answer to this?
I think it's sort of what your team decides on. If you're forming a strategy and you're told you have X amount of money and you need to move forward with 2 opportunities, 2 ideas, then yes, probably coming to consensus around 2 ideas is important. I think if you're doing it as sort of a workshop, whole systems in a room, and you're just trying to make connections across different stakeholders, then coming to a consensus probably isn't the key. It's more saying, oh, so you're really well placed to do this. I'm really well placed to do this. If we keep working in these separate areas, it'll actually also affect this 3rd leverage point. And so we're able to sort of change the entire system by working in different parts. And so I think it depends on the dynamics of who's in the room and what the goals of this are. But one of the reasons why I at least like to rank them by feasibility first and then choose impact is because it does help you to make that prioritization. And so a lot of times if you ask people to just rank one at a time, say, what do you think the feasibility is? What do you think the impact is? You'll have a lot of overlapping nodes that are overlapping leverage points that end up being in the same place on the map. And so then prioritizing top 2 is a lot harder if you have 3 leverage points that are kind of the same feasibility and the same impact. And so by sort of starting out by ranking them on feasibility, you won't run into that, and it'll help you to come to a consensus quicker. So I think we've hit all of the questions, hopefully, but keep them coming in and we'll continue to try to answer them.
Yep, I think we'll have some time at the end to answer some questions. So I'll pass it on to Morgan to just talk about what's next once you've done the feasibility versus impact matrix. What can you do after that? And Morgan, off to you.
Thank you. So once you've identified these leverage areas and which ones might be most impactful or feasible among the people in the room or individuals in the room, we then need to start devising a strategy for these leverage points and figuring out who is best placed to contribute to each intervention. That's something that came out of these questions that Hina's already started for you. The big story here is about what happens next is about sustaining the conversation, bringing ourselves back to what the purpose of this systems mapping, systems sensing, causal loop diagramming was in the first place, which is getting people talking, bringing people into a room who don't always have the chance to engage together in this way, and ultimately improving systems health. So whatever strategy you have for moving forward, it's important at this stage to start to think about how will the relationships live on beyond our experience working with this group? Are there ways that they can come together later on once the systems mapping process is over? Will they meet again to map the system and see how it's changed over time, or simply to continue the conversation in person? Next slide, please. So wrapping things up, I wanted to share some areas where we can connect. If you have questions or conversations that we don't get onto in this session, please do feel free to reach out to us. This is something that we're really passionate about and excited to be working on. And we're always happy to talk more and explore conversations about systems thinking, systems sensing, systems leadership, all things systems.
We have about 5 minutes left, and we would love to open for questions. And so if anyone has any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat box.
And maybe here we could think back over the first and the second session too, and how this all ties together. We got quite technical in sessions 2 and 3, and I'm interested to hear for you guys how that tied in for you, and how you're learning from the technical aspect and how it ties into our broader systems thinking hats that we learned to put on in session 1.
As those questions are coming in, I will just mention a follow-up action. So for those of you who are interested in getting those certificates of completion, Katie and Morgan and I will sit down and look through the old quizzes and the attendance sheets to see who's attended so far and has done the quizzes so far, and we'll send you a confirmation that we've received your quizzes this week sometime. And for those of you who have attended the sessions but have not taken the quizzes, feel free to take them still. So if you haven't taken the session 1 quiz, then you're still welcome to take them as long as you attended that first session. And there will be one more quiz after this session. So once you complete that quiz, then you'll get another confirmation email too. If you have any questions, you can feel free to email me at hina@gkiinitiative.org. I'll put it in the chat box so that you know how to email, how to spell that. And if you don't get an email from us, then feel free to check up on the progress of your certificate. So I see that there's some questions coming in. Marjorie is asking, is the platform easy to figure out, or would it be helpful to have another session to show how the Kumu platform works? I'll pass this on to Morgan, who is our Kumu expert. Morgan, what do you think?
So it's funny you call me a Kumu expert, because what I'm going to say is that any of you can be a Kumu expert. That Kumu themselves have a plethora of resources online. If you go to docs.kumu.io, I'm typing that into the chat right now. It has a lot of helpful reference resources. And there's also a really active, they call themselves the community, a community of Kumu users who share tips and tricks for using Kumu. So I would encourage you to have a play around and have a read through the documentation. And of course, if GKI comes to do a Kumu training, we'll reach out to you, to those who are interested, and invite you to come along. It's certainly something we're looking at including in our curriculums in the future.
Yep, and as someone who is not a Kumu expert, I can tell you that it's pretty easy to use and very intuitive. You just have to go in and play around. And then there's also YouTube videos that you can watch to familiarize yourself a little bit more in terms of how to use the platform itself.
I think we had an interesting comment there from Bilale Chadi, who notes how challenging it is to determine how high to set the bar on rigor for the analytic process, while bearing in mind the capacity and the interests of the facilitator or the local systems actors. And I think that's really key. Oh, that's Claire. Nice to meet you, Claire. Sorry for the misnomer. That's a really interesting point, and this is where we get to sort of the art of storytelling, really. And when we're drawing up these visuals, you'll find that there are a million different ways of connecting things and many different ways of drawing the maps. And part of the art is to know how to, or to decide with the group and by consistently validating your map and through an iterative process, eventually drawing up a map that might have fewer connections, might not tell this infinite story, but helps you share that narrative and helps you move forward in telling the story and determining areas of intervention. So that is part of the game. It's that balance of analysis versus being able to really talk about it and get into the nuts of it.
Thanks everyone for the feedback about how useful this session has been. And if you do end up using this in a room with your clients or your team, we would love to hear about your experience with it via email, or even if you want to set up a quick call. We really want to hear about how you take these learnings going forward and how you use them. So please keep in touch. Another comment we have is from Sarah Clark. She's saying leverage points were very useful to learn about in terms of transforming this tool into a real conversation starter for action taking among groups. The feasibility impact matrix was a great tool for a group decision making tool. Yeah. So I think the feasibility and impact matrix is really, really useful, but there's other tools too that you can look up and use based on what your team needs are or what your needs are. And so this is one great tool, but if you end up using any other ones, then let us know. Marjorie is saying what number to call to share experience. Marjorie, feel free to email me, and then we'll also have a feedback survey after this in terms of to share about your experience. And then if you would want to have a follow-up really short call to talk about your experience, then we can set something up for that too. Thank you, everyone. And we're at 10:30 DC time, so we'll end it here. And we'll send that final homework assignment over email. Have a great day.
Thank you all so much for joining.
Thank you. And thank you, Hina and Katie.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.